Hey, how's it going? I'm Sephiros, and today I'm going to be showing you the most efficient way I have found to do side chaining in Ableton Live. And a little extra piece of sauce that'll clean up your mixes just that little bit more, give it a little bit more definition and clarity. So that's part of it. And yeah, I'm going to be using MIDI triggered side chaining with Shaper Box, but you could use Gatekeeper or any number of other MIDI triggerable sidechain plugins. And you can also use this method with your regular old compression using a sidechain compressor. And this method will still work just fine. So either way, I'm going to be making a case for why you should use sidechain, or why I use sidechaining triggered by MIDI, and why I use Shaperbox. So yeah, hopefully I'll convince you to move to that. You can get a MIDI triggerable sidechain volume shaping plugin pretty inexpensively, so it's not a huge investment. So yeah, let's go. So I'm going to build a loop for you to show this, and this is also going to be a little mini crash course on how I organize my project files, because that's a really important thing for me to make the writing process a lot more efficient, and so I don't have to think about it. So first things first, I like to use a drum rack for my main kick and snare, or kicks and snares. So I'm going to go into my sample pack that I'm putting out this month called Kicks and Snares, and it's just a bunch of drums. So we'll go in here and choose a snare. Use this rim shot, and actually I'm going to get my sampler preset out first, because I set the sampler to have certain settings so that it's just a little bit less work to get things right. And I'll take another sampler and put it on C1. I like to have my kick on C1, so let's go in here and get a kick now. I'm going to turn up the volume of my whole project so you can hear. Let's use this kick. So now I have a kick and a snare. And then I like to have a separate drum rack for my hats. So I'll get another drum rack and put that on my hat, or put that on a channel, and get just a hi-hat. So then we have a hat, and I can make a little pattern here. But first, for the instruments. So for the instruments, I like to have a group and call it sidechained. And then everything in this group will get sidechained to the kick and snare. So I'm going to put something in here to be sidechained. So I'm just going to get a granulator out and do a little chord progression with the granulator. I'll go into my samples and just find some sort of melodic sample here. So I'll go into my melodic samples and just find something more or less random, maybe a Kalen Ellis. Yeah, let's work with that. So I'm just going to make a quick chord progression with the granulator. I'm just going to put a MIDI note on C3. And then I'm just going to hit record. I'm going to go down 5 here. All right, that'll do. Okay, so we have our kicks and snares. I'm going to label this meat. I learned this from the Ill Gates. And then potatoes. So meat is like your core drums, the meat of the meal. Sorry, all my vegetarians out there. You can substitute that for beans. Meat. Then potatoes is like the supporting stuff. You know, like your hats and your perks and whatnot. And so I'll sidechain this little chord progression. I want this to be pretty full, this melodic thing, so that you can really hear what the compression is going to be doing or what the ducking is going to be doing. So let me just get a quick bass line going here. So let's see. Let's get a, okay, I already have a default sub as my default MIDI track, so I can play a little bass line for you here. Just getting that in tune. It's just a Moog sine wave. right, so now we got like a little bass line, a little chord progression. So now I'll set up the side chaining. So I'm gonna just do a simple drum beat. I guess I'll start with the hats. So instead of how I showed in my previous tutorial, putting external instruments inside this drum rack, what I've learned recently to do is to create another MIDI channel. And I'll put this all in a group and call it drums. And this is all the drums, and then this will be my sidechained stuff. So we'll send the trigger from this MIDI channel, right? So I'm going to delete this instrument off the MIDI channel. So it's a blank MIDI channel, and what I'll do is I'll set the MIDI up here to receive from Meet, and then I'll select in on the monitoring so that it's always listening. So it doesn't have to be record armed to hear the MIDI coming from my main kick and snare. So if you look here on the far right where it shows the MIDI registering, you can see that it is indeed receiving MIDI. So what you can do is on this MIDI channel, you can put whatever trigger system you want. So for me, what I'm going to use is the external instrument. If you're using sidechaining, if you're using sidechain compression, what you can do is you can put like an operator or something that generates a sound, and what you can do is you can set this to play white noise, and then you can set the envelope to be a very short little burst of white noise. So you hear that? It's a very tiny little transient. And that's just going to automatically hit whenever you play your kick and snare. So now you can just change your pattern however you like, and automatically your sidechain is going to follow whatever changes you make. So you don't have to do any copy and pasting of triggers or anything like that. So it's a big time saver there if you've been doing it the old way. So if you're using this method, you would obviously then put a compressor on the sidechain group and set the sidechain to receive from this trigger, and I'll call this trigger. So for me, what I'm going to do is MIDI triggered. So what I'm going to do is put an external instrument on this trigger channel, and then I'll put my ducking plugin, I'm going to use Shaper Box. And I have a preset. So here's my preset. I've saved this preset. So it's already set up to receive sidechaining, and it's already set up to do sidechain ducking. And then it's already macroed with a mix so that I can turn the mix down on it and effectively easily mute the ducking for breakdowns and build-ups and whatnot. So I'll delete this rack and build it from scratch so you can see how I do this with Shaper Box. I'll get a Shaper Box out and I'll select volume, and then I'm going to go up here to the length and the LFO mode. I'm going to put the mode on Hertz, and then I'm going to select MIDI trigger one shot. So now it's just going to play through this and stop. It's not going to loop like an LFO. And then I'm going to hold Control and create one of these white points by control clicking. And then I'll put that like right here, and then another one and another one. So that's my basic shape. And you can see down here it says the millisecond amount, and that's going to be really important. And this is my main case for why you should use this style of ducking versus a compressor, is because you can be incredibly meticulous in how you shape the shape. So in developing this shape, I'm going to base this mostly off the kick, because the kick's going to be a little bit longer than my snare. So I'll go to the kick and I'll look over here. And we can see this kick has about 125 milliseconds of time. And it starts to go down in volume at around 70 milliseconds. So I can start my trigger size at around, and I can increase this speed here to give myself more room to work. So I'll make the overall thing about 200 milliseconds. So you can see over here on the right, it says 200 milliseconds. And then I have plenty of room to work with, so I'll go over here to around 70, and you can see down on this bottom part of the plugin, when you drag this point, it'll tell you exactly what millisecond you're at. So let's go to 75, and then I'm going to create a point by just clicking without any control click, and that creates this different type of point. So this is like a more flexible type of breakpoint, and I'll just do 2 like this. An S curve is always going to be the cleanest sounding curve with automation and stuff. And then the reason why I left this front little section is so I can have a really nice smooth transition into the ducking. And what I'll do is I'll move this to about 10 milliseconds. I feel like 10 milliseconds is usually pretty good. 10 milliseconds. And then for this to not cut off the transient of my drum, here's the little secret, or not a secret, but it's a little trick that I use. Over here on the track delay, you can open up this little D right here on the bottom of Ableton on the right. Oops, that might be cut off. So there's this little D down at the bottom, and that opens and closes the track delay. And what I'll do here is I'll just add a bit of negative track delay. I'm going to do 10, let's start at 10 milliseconds. And so what that's doing is it's pushing all my triggers left on the timeline. And what that means is that my sidechain trigger is going to be triggered 10 milliseconds before the actual drum sample gets triggered. So what that's going to give me is a little piece of silence for us to complete this little transition here at the beginning of the duck. So we'll have a nice, smooth little piece of quiet before every drum hit. And I find that that just really gives the mix a whole nother level of definition, because it gives your ear a tiny bit of space to prepare for each drum hit before it hits. So now all I have to do is go over here on the sidechain trigger group and send the MIDI to sidechained. and then it defaults to go to shaper box. And then also, like I did before, I'm going to group it, open up the macros, configure the mix at the top right of the plugin, right click, map to macro 1, and now I can turn it off and on easily with a gradient, so I can blend in to my sidechain. So if I want a less dramatic sidechain that's not sidechaining all the way to minus infinity, I can just turn down this mix. And instead of, I think, creating a parallel mix, what this is doing is just essentially kind of like moving these points up for me. So I'm pretty sure that's what's happening. I'll leave it on fully wet for now. And let's look again at our kick shape. So between 70 milliseconds and around 130 milliseconds, we have a pretty dramatic ramp on our volume of our kick drum. So I'll go over here from 70 milliseconds to about 130. Boom, there we are. And the transition is pretty steep, so maybe I'll do something like this. And now that's going to be about exactly the shape of our kick drum. Obviously, it's inverted. And we'll have an extra bit of silence here to really let that transient of the drum come through. So now let's listen to our mix. I'll do no sidechain and then sidechain. So I'll blend it in as we listen. So nice and clean, and like I said, if you like doing it the old school way, here's how I would do that. So I could put a, I'll just get a sampler. Sampler's a little bit more CPU efficient. So I'll turn off my old trigger, and we'll do the old school way with the compressor. So I'll get a hat. Yeah, tiny little hat. Just get like a little piece of that hat. And so if we listen, I can go in here to the sample and just turn the scale on the tuning to 0. So it's always going to play the original pitch no matter what MIDI note comes in. And for this method, you're going to want to mute the channel so you don't actually hear that hat. And then over here on the sidechain group, we can get a compressor. And then expand the sidechain, select audio from trigger, and then dial in our settings. And something that you may experience with the compressor is sometimes there's unwanted pops when it transitions to silence, because you can see there's an attack parameter. We can turn the attack parameter up, and that'll get rid of that little pop. And also, it should be noted that since we did do the negative track delay on our trigger, we can now afford to use attack without overlapping our transient with the rest of the mix on our kick and snare. So I can actually increase this attack to 10 milliseconds because we have 10 milliseconds of negative track delay. And then the release, 40 milliseconds. That's about how long it takes to come from silence back up. And then I set the threshold to minus infinity. That way it's going to snap everything fully minus infinity. As we decrease the ratio, you'll hear less and less ducking. You can see on the visual readout here, as I decrease the ratio, it's ducking less and less. So if I increase it all the way to minus infinity, it's going to duck all the way to minus infinity. And how I dial in this shape more is with the knee. So watch what happens when I use the knee. So the knee will create a little bit of less or more smooth. And then finally, if you're still getting some weird pops or something, you can always use this look ahead, and you can turn this look ahead up to 1 or 10 milliseconds. And what that'll do is that'll add latency to your overall project, and that affords the plugin a little extra time to analyze the audio before it does the ducking, and therefore it can eliminate some of the artifacts from the compression. So that's how you would do it with a compressor. I mean, that's a fine way of doing it, but you can hear So if you're working with audio triggers and you don't have like a shaper box or something, another thing you can do here, instead of using like a sample of a hat, you can calculate the exact time that it takes for your drum hit to play. So you can get like an operator, turn it on noise, white noise, and then here in the envelope, you can set the amount of time it takes. So you can set your decay and your release. So if you go over here and you have it start at the top and then have it come down, you can set this attack time to be 70 milliseconds because that's what our kick is doing. So 70 milliseconds. And then the decay can be 40 milliseconds. And then you can put your release all the way up. So that way it's going to play through this entire little envelope every time. So that sounds like this if I listen to the noise. So that's going to be the exact shape of your kick. And so that'll give the compressor the exact shape you need. And for this, you want to turn the release all the way down, because now the envelope follower is going to really hug that shape. You can still leave some attack on the compressor, but if you turn your release all the way down, it's going to really hug that shape. So you can hear that's doing a little bit more ducking. So if you're not getting enough with a little tiny hat as a transient, you can use the operator and set the exact time you want with the white noise. So I prefer the shaper box method. I think you can be more exact with it. And yeah, that's how I do my sidechaining now. See, I think that you can get a lot more transparent with the shaper box. I think it just sounds a lot better. Another plugin that I used to use for a while is called Gatekeeper. And this is another plugin that does like the same thing basically. And the way you set it up is you just hit this play button so that it stops playing, and then you send the MIDI the same way with the external instrument. And for this, you do right click and drag to curve the lines. So I think this has a kind of a nicer interface than Shaperbox, but I've had some issues with it in the past, so I decided not to use it in favor of Shaperbox. If we go here and we look at the latency, sometimes Gatekeeper adds more latency, but yeah, with this Shaperbox, we're adding 0.33 milliseconds of latency or 16 samples, so that's not too bad. The track delay is adding another like 10 milliseconds of latency to the project. So it takes like 10 milliseconds for it to play after I hit the spacebar. And that's gonna throw you off if you're playing stuff in. So if you're like an instrumentalist and you play a lot of stuff in, it's good to wait to add the track delay until later in the writing process. But for me, I like to do it early on, just so everything sounds good. I really like things to sound good when I'm working on them because I find it inspiring. So I am one of those types of people who like to mix. I like to mix as I go. So like I like to do things like this right off the bat just to like keep everything clean and sounding nice while I'm mixing. And so my mixing process is 100% part of my writing process, and I find that I usually don't have to spend too long mixing the track once I'm done writing because I've done it during the process. So that's kind of a time saver. I feel like it takes longer for me to write tracks that way, but overall I feel like it comes out sounding more cohesive. And a lot of the mixing things I do are automated mixing, so like automating EQs, automating reverbs, automating delays, automating a ton of gain. So my mixes are very like in motion. A lot of like I hardly ever do like set and forget mixing applications other than maybe a few high passes. But I find often later in the project I'm automating a lot of my mixing, and that applies to the Shaperbox as well. Like sometimes it's good to automate this mix knob, and sometimes it's good to have like a couple instances and go between them. You know, it's not one shape is always going to fit every section of your song. And then also, if I have a tiny snare and a big kick, like let's do that real quick. So sometimes it's nice to have a tiny snare like that, and you can hear that the sidechain ducking sounds horrible now because the snare is so much shorter than the actual shape being triggered. And so for that, what I would do is I would duplicate my trigger, and then I would set it to receive from, and if I play the transport, I'll be able to see on this little menu what's what. So watch how I do this. So if I hit play, I'll then select this to be my kick trigger, and this will be my snare trigger. So I want to set the input instead of post effects. I want to set it to receive from the snare itself. So now I've branched those MIDI triggers being sent from this drum rack so that this one's getting the snare MIDI and this one's getting the kick MIDI. And then if I go here and I call this kick and then duplicate it and I call this snare, I can go in here and make this shape smaller. So if I go look at my snare, the snare is 33 milliseconds long because I set the decay to be 33 milliseconds, real tiny snare. So in this snare shape, I can go over here and drag this over to 33 milliseconds, and it's going to start sloping down earlier, so I can even drag this more to like 20 milliseconds, and then I'll drag this over as well, and this will end at like maybe, it might be nice to have a little silence after the snare, so let's try like 48 milliseconds, so really tiny shape there. And then I can go here to the snare trigger channel and select snare on this little drop down. You can see before there was no secondary drop down on the external instrument. Now that on the sidechain group I have 2 ShaperBox instances, now we have a secondary drop down where I can select which instance I want to send the MIDI to. So I'll send the MIDI to snare on the snare trigger, and on the kick, I'll make sure it's on the kick. And now we have 2 different shapes. So now I'll show you how that sounds. Now, another thing with tiny snares especially is sometimes it sounds weird to duck the sub. So one thing that I like about ShaperBox is maybe for this mix in particular, it would sound better to not duck the sub and just duck the top of the mix for that snare. We'll leave the kick ducking the sub, but if I go over here and drag right, I can create a lower band that has no shape to it. It's just letting the signal in through clean. And then I can select here to just duck the top with this shape I created. So with that method, I can then select 6, 12, or 24 dB for the slope cutoff. And note this will cause a slight bit of phasing on your whole mix. So I often don't use this. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But yeah, let's do 12 dB and listen how that sounds. So that's sounding pretty good now. It definitely sounds less awkward to not duck the sub there. So yeah, the other thing you can do is have a different sidechain group for your subs and basses and whatnot, but I like having just one. It makes everything a little bit easier. So if you wanted to, instead of use ShaperBox's multiband mode, later in the mixdown process, you could branch out and start putting instances on particular things and sidechaining them differently. But for the writing process, I like just the simple method of having 1 or 2 instances here. And yeah, so this was sounding better with a bigger snare, I think. So let's backpedal a little bit and just go with a bigger snare. So let's use this. And things don't always sound good sidechained to the snare. Like for this loop, it's kind of more chill. It kind of sounds good to not sidechain things to the snare and just sidechain them to the kick. So that's what we're doing here because we have this kick trigger receiving just from the kick. But let's try the whole drum rack again by selecting these top, either pre or post. So, I guess one last thing I'll point out is sometimes it's good to have like other things sidechained that you maybe wouldn't think of sidechaining, like a snare reverb or a send. So maybe I have a send, right? So I'll insert a return track, and on this return track I'll put a reverb. And I like sends because you can send just moments to the reverb instead of having to automate them. It's just a kind of a nice thing to use, but I don't want to have to put another instance of ShaperBox on this and duplicate my triggers and all that. It's pretty inefficient. So what I'll do here on this reverb is I will go to the reverb audio routing, and instead of sending it straight to the master, I can send it to the sidechain group. And that'll go right into the group and get sidechained. And also, what I usually do is I'll create an audio channel and I'll call it reverb send, reverb send A, and then I can send that to reverb send A to the track in, and then set this to in so that it's always listening. And that way I can put effects on here and automate them and control it. So now we have a reverb send that'll go into our sidechain group and get sidechained and then go to the master. So maybe this last snare, I just want to send that last snare to the reverb. And a lot of times what I'll do is I have a default utility on my default audio track. So whenever I load up a default audio track with Command T, it comes plug and play with a turned off Pro Q3 and a utility, because those are like my two most used plugins. So I'll go automate this gain on the reverb to get quiet on the downbeat so that it doesn't like ride through. There's a little grace kick here, so maybe I'll actually automate the reverb to get silent right before that kick. And if you use this utility method with the reverb sends, you can have you can automate the gain, so you can create these cool little risers. And the cool thing about having a send is you can like send multiple things to the same thing, which is kind of like the whole point of a send. So I could send a little chunk of this chord to the send as well, and then just this little piece of the audio will go to the send instead of the whole thing. And that's kind of fun to do with multiple things in the same reverb. You can't really hear it there, but it adds just a little different character to the reverb send. So, you know, by that same effect, you can have other time-based effects in your sends like delays and stuff, and then have them automatically get sidechained. You know, you could also create an overall like room reverb for your drums. So maybe I'll just get another hybrid reverb, set it to fully wet, high pass it a bit, and right here what I'll do is I'll set the audio input of this audio channel to receive from the drums. I could do the whole entire drum group, so hats and everything. So this whole entire drum group here is being routed into this audio channel. I can call this drum reverb. And then all I do is set it to input, and that's going to listen to the input and run it through this reverb. And since I set the reverb fully wet, we have this. So that adds a whole new level of kind of dimensionality to my drums, but all the transients are clean because they're getting sidechained. So you can put all kinds of cool stuff in this sidechain group, even sending your audio from the drums right into the sidechain group, so you can keep all your drums in the drum group but still have them sidechained. So like you could have like a, I don't know, let's look for a shaker loop. Yeah, so I'll do this. I'll just get this loop in time real quick. And then let's try sending that to the sidechain group instead. So instead of sending it to drums, let's try sending it to the sidechain and see if it's now sidechained out of the way. So that actually, for some reason, didn't work. So what I'll do is I'll just create an audio channel, call it shaker, and then I can, instead of sending it, I can, I think, set it to receive, or actually let's send it, let's send it to shaker, and then track in, and then set this audio channel to receive in. So there are certain percussion elements that sound good sidechained. You know, alternatively, you could just put this in the sidechained group and have a sidechained perks group. And that's what I usually do. That's just an organizational thing. Doesn't really matter, but I like having my own kind of sidechained perk group. And I said I wanted to talk a little bit about how I organize stuff. So within this sidechain group, the order I like to have things is I like to have the bass at the top because I like to be able to look at the bass relationship to the kick. And I like to have the main, like the meat drums, at the bottom of this drums group so that I can see the meat aligned with the sidechain. And using these groups, it's really nice to be able to close all the groups or close the individual groups and see everything a little bit easier. So within the drums group, I usually like to have a perks group, and that's where I'll put all my perks and toms and all that, and then have the meat outside so I can close the perks and just see everything a little bit easier. And then so I use the groups as like an organizational tool. I'll have like my bass group first. I like to make that like a red or something so it really stands out. And then go ahead and have the next most important thing, which would be the melodics. So I'll call this our chords, and then I'll group that and call this melodics. And that's just where I put like all the melodic content. And then I like to have my effects group at the bottom. And that's where I'll put things like this drum reverb, like the reverb send, and I'll usually make that like a different color than the other stuff. So I kind of I like to make the melodies like blue a lot of the time. And these are the sidechained perks. I'll put the perks like above the effects because they're a little bit more important than the effects. And then, yeah, so I like to organize things like that where it's like bass, melodic stuff, percussion, and effects. And then I'll have obviously a different perks group for the stuff that I don't want to be sidechained. Like I often don't like my hats to be sidechained to the kick and snare. I think that can sound kind of ugly a lot of the time. But for things like shakers, a lot of times it does sound good to sidechain those. Same goes for like crashes and splashes and things like that. A lot of times that stuff does sound good sidechained. And then I do like to sidechain my effects to the kick and snare, so I'll have that in there. And since these are all in their own little buses, I can now have things like utilities on each bus. I usually put a utility on each bus so that I can easily mute everything. And I can automate the mutes at the group level. So say I have like 100 or like 30 channels of melody stuff in here. I can easily just go and mute it all on the group level like this. So that's a really useful thing. And then I also do like to have like a clipper or a limiter on each bus and start to squish everything at the bus level and then squish it all together at the sidechain level. And then when it comes to unifying the sidechain and the drums, I do like to group those and put this in a group called pre. And the pre channel is a little bit unnecessary because it's all being summed to the master anyways. So it's a little bit unnecessary, but for me, it's just a workflow hack, or not a hack, but a workflow thing that I really like, because what it does is it allows you to close your entire project and see it as a little bar. And so a lot of times I'll close the pre-group so that all I'm looking at is this little bar, and then start doing things like duplicating, copy and pasting, cutting time, things like that. So it's just a lot easier and really nice to be able to close your entire project into a single pre-group and then see the little pieces there. It's just a little bit less overwhelming that way. So that's kind of what I use the pre-group for, and then the pre-group obviously will have like another clipper or limiter on it. So this allows you to do the whole Skrillex busing template thing without having to use sends and all that. It's just a lot cleaner to do it this way, I think, and a lot easier to deal with. So that's kind of how I organize everything. I have the top priority stuff at the top, and then move down in priority from top to bottom. So the most important thing to me is the kick and snare. So I have that at the top, easily accessible. I always know where it's at. And then less important stuff above that, because I like the kick and snare to be closest to the sidechain group. And then lower priority stuff going from sidechain bass, melodies, sidechained perks and effects. And side note, if you're a vocal producer and you're using actual vocals, I would recommend having a different group called vocals and have this be inside the pre-group. Just put it at the top, because if you're working with vocals, that's the most important thing. And then with this vocals, I would recommend doing less sidechaining or no sidechaining and have its own individual sidechain. So you would duplicate this sidechain trigger and then duplicate this over to your vocals group. And then you can treat your vocals individually and differently than you treat all the stuff that's in your sidechain group. And then I would recommend grouping your sidechain and drums and summing those first, like you would with the Skrillex busing template. So you would have these be the instrumental, and you would sum the instrumental through something like a saturator or something to glue it together, and then put the vocals in on top and sum the instrumental and the vocals together at the pre-stage or at the master stage if you don't want to use a pre-stage. And then the last thing I do, I always have a channel above the pre-group that is set to resample from the pre-group. And actually, because I actually just started using this track delay thing on the trigger inputs, and the track delay only becomes apparent sampling the master. So if I sample the pre, I don't think the track delay will be in it. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's just the same sampling the master itself. So I like to have a sampling setup where I can always just hit record and boom. That way I can always sample the master. I can have it be like pre-effects or post-effects instead of post-mixer, and that way it won't get turned down if my master's turned down, because my master's turned down -6. So that's always really nice, because my process involves a lot of resampling the master and then you taking this and like stretching it out. So I do that a lot periodically throughout the writing process, where I'll sample the master and then manipulate it and chop those back in as effects inside the sidechain group, in the effects group, or if it's like bass, I'll put in the bass. But yeah, that's how I organize everything, and I do this as I go so that the project doesn't get messy and overwhelming, and I always make sure to name things as I go so that when I'm like 10 hours into writing a track, it's not this giant garbled mess, because that's how my projects used to look like a year ago. I only started doing this kind of in the last year. But for like 8 years of producing, my projects were just a giant mess of random stuff. And I would find myself scrolling through this long list of chains looking for stuff, and I'm like, where is it? So I find that sorting things by priority and by what's most important just makes the most sense to me. So that's why I do it that way. It's really important to have a hierarchy of importance in your mix down, and so this really helps with the mix down, because you can, at the group level, at the bus level here, because groups are buses, you can easily mix your track once you start bussing things like this, because you can turn everything in the melodics down, all the bass down, maybe your effects need to come up. So you can do all your gain staging inside the groups and then mix them at the group level really easily. And if you look over here on the session view, it's the same deal, where you can close all these groups so that the project's not overwhelming. And then you're just mixing like 6 buses, and you can easily just mess with your faders and get everything lined up nice without having to look at like hundreds of channels. So that's my philosophy on how I organize things, and that's how I do MIDI triggered sidechaining with Shaperbox. I highly recommend Shaperbox. It's a great plugin. This is not sponsored or anything. I just love the plugin. I think it's great. Yeah, if you have any questions, you know what to do. Comment them down below. If you like the video, then like and subscribe. If you're interested in some of these drum samples or anything I showed, I put out sample backs once a month on my Patreon. That's at Sephiros, 5EPHRO5 on Patreon. If you want to check out my music, SoundCloud is goated, but also Spotify or whatever. And yeah, until next time, I'm Sephiros. Peace. And big up.